In the late hours of the night in Gaza, children jumped for joy. Despite telecom blackouts and weak internet signals, Palestinians went out to the streets to spread the word. A deal has been struck. It's not exactly a ceasefire, but the first phase of a peace plan. After 2 years and 1 day, Israel, Hamas, the US, and other mediators have finally come to an agreement. But the optimism this time is very cautious. There's a sigh of relief that at the very least, the bombs could stop falling. But after the last ceasefire collapsed, people are understandably skeptical. So what exactly does phase 1 mean this time? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. In this episode, we look at the terms of the agreement, what's in it, what's missing, and what will happen next. I'm joined by the National's correspondent in Cairo, Hamza Hendawi. Hamza has been closely following the ceasefire talks since day one. I asked him what we know so far.
The agreement that is going to be signed on the first phase of the 20-point plan, it would involve the handover of the 48 hostages that Hamas has held since October 23, and Israel will pull back to what they call the yellow line to allow the process of handing over the hostages take place. As always, Hamas has conditions that it needs to see on the ground before it releases hostages, such as the total cessation of hostilities, of course, and a suspension of all reconnaissance flights. What comes after is a great deal more complicated and will involve perhaps also a great deal of negotiations.
What do we know about when it's supposed to take effect? Because we've already seen Israel strike Gaza just hours after Trump said the fighting would end. What do we know about where we are right now and when it's going to actually materialize?
I think once the agreement is signed in Sharm el-Sheikh, Israeli troops will pull back to what they call the yellow line. First batch of the hostages will most likely be most, if not all, the living hostages. It gets to be a little bit more complicated when it comes to the remains of hostages who died while in captivity, because when they died, they were buried in the tunnels. Many of those tunnels have since been destroyed in Israeli strikes, so they need to locate the spots where they are buried and exhume the bodies.
Does this phase 1 match what was outlined in the 20-point Gaza plan, or has anything changed since then? Do we expect the parties to even adhere to this plan?
It is difficult to say at this point what Hamas and Israel will do going forward. However, yes, the first phase, which is the release of hostages and in exchange for the release of hundreds of Palestinians incarcerated in Israeli prisons, is indeed what was spelled out in the plan. However, even that first phase, although it looks simple, might actually be a little bit more complicated than we thought. For example, will Israel agree to the release of high-profile Palestinians who have been convicted on security-related charges and are serving long jail terms or multiple life terms? I'm talking about people like Marwan Barghouthi, Ahmed Saadat, and Ibrahim Hamid of the Al-Qassam brigades. I understand that Israel has agreed, but I'm also hearing that Israel may not release these people. A significant portion of the Israeli cabinet that see the release of people like that is a recipe for disaster going forward, due to their charisma, to the weight they carry within Palestinian communities and the Palestinian movement as a whole.
Smotrich is already saying that Hamas should be eradicated the moment the hostages are released. What are the guarantees that Israel is not going to go back to killing people in Gaza once the hostages are released?
There are no guarantees, except perhaps that I'm told that President Trump has offered guarantees that this deal will be followed through. Israel has always breached ceasefire deals. I mean, has Israel really ceased altogether attacking Gaza over the last 20 years? The answer is no. A more recent example is Lebanon. They've had a ceasefire since last year after Israel's war with Hezbollah. But ever since, Israel continues to strike at what it calls Hezbollah targets, and at least 100 people have died in Lebanon. Many of them are civilians since the ceasefire was declared. So there is no telling what's going to happen. Also, what's going to happen if President Trump, after all the effort that he has done on the Gaza front, what if he does not win the Nobel Peace Prize? Will he continue to be motivated to be the peacemaker of the world?
Hamza, what is the mechanism for releasing the hostages? Are we going to see the same kind of images that we saw during the ceasefire the first time around, where the ICRC would be picking up the hostages in trucks, people surrounding Hamas dressed up in their full gear? What are we expecting? Do we know anything?
I'm afraid no, we don't know any details about this. I'm hearing about some Egyptian roles in the handover process. I'm sure Israel will insist on the involvement of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Will Hamas do parade-like shows on the release of the hostage? When we had last releases back in January, Israel took exception to the fanfare that surrounded the release of the hostages, with Hamas typically trying to portray everything as a glorious victory for the movement. So difficult to say at this moment, but like I said before, even the swap of hostages for Palestinian prisoners can go wrong if Israel refuses to release those high-profile Palestinians that Hamas wants to see walk free from Israeli jails. So that's another possibility. We, at the National, like everywhere else, we are relying almost entirely on leaks from people who are involved in the talks. I don't think these negotiations are taking place in complete transparency. There are no news conferences. There's very symbolic or token media access. The only thing that is to be considered definitive is what we hear directly from the people involved or from statements detailing how the process is going. The truth will unfold in small portions over the next few days or next few weeks.
What else is there as part of that phase one agreement? Just hostages and prisoner releases. And then what? Where does Israel withdrawal and Hamas disarmament come in?
These bigger issues that you've mentioned will have to be dealt with what I imagine to be lengthy and tortuous negotiations going forward. One contentious issue that you've mentioned is whether Hamas will agree to disarm. So far, we know that Hamas rejects disarmament altogether, but is only willing to hand over its offensive weapons to the Egyptians or under Egyptian supervision to be stored in Gaza. So that's one thing. Hamas has already agreed to Israel's demand that it creates a buffer zone that runs on the Gaza side of the border with Israel. So that is an example of Hamas flexibility. But will Israel leave the rest of Gaza? Maybe, under a great deal of U.S. pressure. In the same vein, will Israel be willing to leave the Philadelphia corridor, which Egypt is very keen on seeing happen for reasons to do with its own national security? But like I said, the first phase, even though it can go south, is the easy one compared to what comes afterwards with the withdrawal, the disarmament or lack thereof of Hamas, and also who is going to rule Gaza going forward. That's also very tricky. Hamas already wants or does not want any foreign troops, including Arabs, on Palestinian territory. Mr. Tony Blair is definitely not desired by the Palestinians, mostly because of his track record vis-a-vis the Iraq war back in 2003. There is a lot to be ironed out. There is a lot to be negotiated. And the question, is there enough good faith on the part of Israel to make this work? But I've spoken to experts who have carefully read the 20-point plan by Trump, and they see that it's almost science fiction to implement it as it is presented.
We don't know anything about phase two. So what we're trying to say here is that phase one is already complicated enough.
Phase one is a phrase that was coined in the last 24 hours. Prior to that, we talked about the entire plan. But I think what's happening here is that possibly the Trump administration wanted a quick victory, and that quick victory they felt lied in a first phase. To the U.S. public, to the Trump administration, seeing those hostages walk free is diplomatic victory, a massive diplomatic victory for Mr. Trump himself.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines. This is a developing story. Follow the latest coverage of the Gaza truce deal on thenationalnews.com. The episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada AlTaher. Thank you for listening.